In this, part 4 of our study of setting in MGSV, we turn now to Central Africa. In September 1979, a sophisticated American spy satellite picked up twin flashes originating in the Indian Ocean. These mysterious shining lights bore all of the hallmarks of a nuclear test, and yet their actual nation of origin was unknown. That's because involved was not only one secret nuclear power, but two, and both were pariahs on the world stage, and had every reason to conceal what they'd just done. These nations, whose partnership had been condemned by UN Resolution 3379 as an unholy alliance, were South Africa and Israel.
South Africa was previously suspected of developing nuclear weapons. It already had a conspicuous presence at the UN because of apartheid and its armed expansionism. But when neighboring Angola and Mozambique became socialist countries in '74, South Africa felt hounded into a corner. So it accelerated its nuclear program to protect itself. 3 years later, the Soviets discovered a test facility, and 2 years after that, an American satellite observed a flash in the southern Indian Ocean. It said this was South Africa conducting a nuclear test with the help of a certain ally. Skullface used the situation in South Africa to get this ally to lend a hand. They both wanted nukes, so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. On the surface, anyway.
The specific region that we visit in the Phantom Pain, however, is the Angola-Zaire border. But as Miller tells us, what we find there is a microcosm for something that, in the 1980s, is happening all over continental Africa and former colonial territories, all over the so-called Third World. That's something we might call Neo-Colonialism. Remember how last time that I said that the British dealt with Afghanistan by widening divisions that were already present there? Well, the exact same is true of how both East and West dealt with the rise of anti-colonial movements in the Third World.
Kunganga Mine. A civil war's been going on in that region for the last 20 years. It's being fought by what are now two ethnic groups, the Buta and the Mbele. Originally, you could barely tell them apart, but the reason for the current armed conflict goes back to World War I. After the war, their land was colonized by a European power, and it decided to give local control to the Buta. That split the two groups into rulers and subjects, laying the foundations for an inevitable civil war.
And it all went back to the UN and its fundamental doctrine of nationalism. When the former Portuguese colony Angola declared independence in 1975, a similar situation resulted as when in 1960 the former Belgian Congo did the same. Larger foreign powers swooped in, preventing independence, and in both cases they did so with mercenaries. A dynamic emerged thanks to the involvement of the Eastern Bloc that equivocated in the West all liberation fronts with communism and all communism with uncivilized barbarism. White mercenaries, meanwhile, flocked to Africa to protect natural resources in places like mineral-rich Katanga, and communists took advantage of inexperienced liberation movements by helping transform their struggle into East versus West proxy wars. However, what cannot be overlooked is how these proxy wars also broke across racial lines. And that brings us to a nation of central focus for MGSV, South Africa, and the wider region that it controlled of white settler states, like Rhodesia. In 1948, a new order was established in South Africa, itself a former member of the British Empire, called Apartheid. Apartheid was an official policy not only of segregation, but white minority rule, a kind of parasitism when you think about it. At one time, whites in South Africa like Jan Smuts, creator of the Royal Air Force, dreamed of also creating a white Africa that snaked up through the Congo River basin, civilizing this continent that Joseph Conrad infamously called the Heart of Darkness. But by the 1970s, that dream was dying, as one by one former African colonies were granted independence and the cordon sanitaire of white-dominated states that divided white South Africa from black African states to the north gave up their ghosts. Desperate, South Africa began to support the racist state Rhodesia, and as we see in MGSV, also intervene in Angola against the new popular movement there, the MPLA, or Movement for the Popular Liberation of Angola, which themselves were backed by the communists. The MPLA and its own former ally, UNITA, were now engaged in a civil war. As the Kremlin and Havana began to support the MPLA, the CIA supported UNITA. But crucially in the CIA's case, not in pursuit of victory. The policy that the CIA pursued was one of a no-win scenario. In other words, a conflict that would drag on for as long as possible, with neither side to prevail. Following Watergate and Vietnam, the US Congress in December of 1975 banned Washington from covertly supporting the anti-government rebels like UNITA in Angola. But the CIA had already set aside $33 million to do just that. They spent this largely on mercenaries to counter the communist-backed MPLA, who were funded in turn with oil. UNITA, on the other hand, funded their efforts by selling what were known as blood diamonds, diamonds sold to fuel wars like theirs in Africa.
Give her the ultimate, a quality diamond of a carat or more.
In the 1980s, the number of blood diamonds that comprised the entire world's supply was around 20%. And by the mid-90s, according to the New York Times, blood diamonds still made up 10 to 15%. This problem would not be made public until the UN's Fowler Report in the year 2000. Though apartheid was more and more unpopular throughout the 80s, conservative US politicians like Ronald Reagan were able to generate tacit, backdoor support for white supremacist warfare in Africa under the banner of anti-communism. Not that American Democrats like Bill Clinton in the 1990s fared much better. When the Rwandan Genocide incident took place in 1994, the Clinton administration did nothing, despite the fact that the US had backed one side of the Ugandan Bush War in the 1980s that directly led to this crisis. But don't think for a second that all Africans are exempt from blame. Take, as one example directly referenced by MGSV, the Congolese dictator Mobutu. Though he was inarguably propped up by would-be white neo-colonial powers like the US, France, and Belgium, Mobutu was a powermonger who would say anything to bleed his own people dry. In public, he espoused a policy known as authenticité, which in the world of MGSV leads him to nationalize the Ngumba industrial zone. Authenticité declared a desire to erase all the last traces of colonialism and Western culture from Zaire. However, Mobutu acted like a colonialist in his own country. Creating a system of such widespread corruption and theft, a new word had to be invented in English to describe it: kleptocracy. But of course, the same word could easily also apply to the whites in South Africa, who not only intervened in the affairs of then Rhodesia as well as Angola, but other nearby countries, including against the Seychelles government in the Indian Ocean, which South African mercenaries tried to overthrow in 1981, something that's also referenced by MGSV. This misadventure involved a plane hijacking and a shootout in a Seychelles airport. The more that South Africa became an international pariah, the more that it pursued nuclear weapons. The only reason that the apartheid government gave them up, once the era of apartheid had ended in the 1990s, was arguably in order to keep those nukes out of the hands of the new black government. But one cannot discuss nukes in South Africa without also discussing the nation that is rapidly in the 21st century becoming the new apartheid state, and for years has managed to keep its own nuclear program a secret: Israel. And that actually requires us to return to the subject of the Yom Kippur War. Not publicly reveal its nuclear arsenal until it's forced to use it. But in the top secret Israeli nuclear facility Dimona, weapons have been in production since 1968. According to Seymour Hersh, when the Arab coalition attacked Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel had in its arsenal over 25 bombs. You'll remember the Sinai Agreement between Israel and the US I mentioned last time. It was actually made, though few people realize this today, to avoid the imminent threat of a nuclear holocaust. Because in response to what seemed to be an imminent total Israeli defeat, Israel began to prepare nuclear strikes, and the world came very close to ending. Some have even called the subsequent strong-arming that this represented of American foreign policy officials like Henry Kissinger a form of blackmail, but that's only one interpretation. After all, few nations on Earth can really claim to have enemies who do not believe in their very right to exist the way Israel does. The situation can only be blamed on the British, and the UN, back at Dimona, of course, needs uranium ore. And for this, frequently Israel had turned to one nation in particular, South Africa. By the late 60s, this relationship became more symbiotic. In exchange for uranium from Johannesburg, Israel provided the apartheid regime with technical expertise to obtain nuclear weapons of South Africa's own. And that makes the racist history of white, so-called settler Africa all the more crucial for us to address. Author Joseph Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness about the African continent in a way that could only come from a white European. It may be one of the most beautifully written novels in the English language, but in some ways, its racism reveals more than its author perhaps realized. Many years after the European and American versions of slavery were supposed to have ended, the book, which was published at the dawn of the 20th century, is set in one of the most racially exploitative settings imaginable, a setting that did not even come into existence until well after the supposed abolition of slavery. The same place where America would turn to for uranium for the atomic bombs that would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In case the relevance of slavery, particularly American slavery, to MGSV wasn't crystal clear, consider that Kikongo, aka Congo, is the specific language, that was spoken by a large percentage of the very equatorial Africans who were forced into slavery and taken to the New World. This legacy is still evident in Heart of Darkness, as the novel depicts black Africans who are worked to death and dehumanized by colonials in all but name. It's also evident in the setting of MGSV, as yet again, independence is denied unofficially to black Africans, who we see being used and exploited for cheap labor, natural resources, and largely held back to enrich colonizers overseas, principally by stirring up ethnic divisions. Some even argue that this legacy of slavery and exploitation will never go away until it is dealt with in full. The namesake of Rhodesia, Cecil Rhodes, whose name is also used for a special kind of scholar in the English-speaking world. Remember how I said last time that a theme for MGSV is a critique of pedagogy? Once said the following: "Why should we not form a secret society with but one object, the furtherance of the British Empire and the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule? What a dream, but yet it is probable, it is possible." End quote. The South African statesman Jan Smuts, the man Mark Mazower calls the architect of white settler nationalism in South Africa, who also helped set up the League of Nations and the United Nations, supported international bodies like the UN precisely because he was a Nazi. David Bergman in 1968 explained the unofficial racist pact between Israel and South Africa like this, quote, "Neither of us has neighbors to whom we can speak, and to whom we are going to be able to speak in the near future. If we are in this position of isolation, perhaps it might be best for both countries to speak to each other." End quote. Now, the United Nations had no problem condemning both Zionism and apartheid in the 1970s, perhaps thanks to the sudden importance of Arab oil states to the global economy. In 1975, with UN General Assembly Resolution 2379, the UN decided that Zionism was a, quote, "form of racism and discrimination," end quote. And in 1973, Resolution 3068 called apartheid a crime against humanity. But when the UN had tried to get involved militarily as well as diplomatically in the mercenary-fueled Congo crisis in the early 60s, the CIA, MI6, and/or a South African paramilitary force retaliated by shooting down the plane of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the UN, out of the sky. He was shot down in northern Rhodesia. The UN subsequently did not formally try to curb the use of mercenaries until 1989. This brings up the crucial role to white supremacist and neo-colonial movements in Africa played by private forces, aka mercenaries. If you have the money but not the numbers, mercenaries make for a great solution. As Guy Arnold describes at length in Mercenaries, the Scourge of the Third World, for many Africans, even now, white mercenaries and white power are synonymous. And this has far outlived the Cold War. To the contrary, according to the Institute for Security Studies, quote, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of apartheid led to the downsizing of the military in many countries. As a result, a substantial number of regular officers and soldiers have sought employment in conflict-affected countries, end quote. Although, in an Orwellian twist, they're no longer called mercenaries, but private military and security companies. As for South Africa and Israel's nuclear relationship, the concept in MGSV of uranium enrichment that's achievable without detection or violation of known laws may in fact be a nod to a unique enrichment method that was devised by these two white settler states around 1970, which used a jet nozzle, according to Seymour Hersh, quote, sophisticated cascade effect, end quote. Both Israel and South Africa saw nukes as a method of dealing with being outnumbered. Democracy be damned, as a way to actually deter the spread and progress of democracy. As everyone knows, the phantom pain is about parasites, but what few have put together is how this parasite conceit applies to the kind of neo-colonial exploitation we've been describing and which we see in the game's choice of setting in Central Sub-Saharan Africa. Put simply, according to the academic journal Review of African Political Economy, quote, mineral wealth has not only financed Angola's war, but intimately shaped the contours of that conflict. MPLA's access to oil revenues and UNITA's to diamonds can help explain the duration and character of the conflict, and to some extent even the timing of military operations, end quote. The article goes on to, quote, question liberal assumptions about the positive effects of trade on peace, end quote. In describing what's been called the resource curse, academic W. Scott Miller writes that the Angolese Civil War epitomizes a case of, quote, natural resources providing motivation for and prolonging a conflict, end quote. It's impossible to ignore how this parasitic dynamic evolved as a direct continuation of colonialism, aided and abetted by the international system codified by the UN. And that is how race returns to the fore for MGSV. The logic of apartheid, or minority rule, is in some ways, I'd argue, the same logic as slavery. Just look at the inherently white supremacist Rhodesia, which in 1965, led by its Prime Minister Ian Smith, refused to give up political control to the country's black majority, arguing that whites knew how to run the government better and more civilized. But those outside powers who got involved against Rhodesia were themselves colonially minded communists, who saw the racial discord as an opportunity to exploit. And the result was a full-blown race war known as the Rhodesian Bush War. This was the conflict identified with the infamous Silu Scouts, while South Africa's 32 Battalion would be active in Angola. Both regiments would be referenced by the Phantom Pain. And again, funding it all were two forms of carbon products, diamonds and oil. As Ian Smillier writes in Blood on the Stone, quote, conflict diamonds kept the war going in Angola for almost 2 decades, end quote. When Miller said he wanted to transform war into a new kind of business, this is what that entailed. Even bin Laden would pounce on the opportunity presented by these conflicts in continental Africa. In 1993, his organization helped train the Somalian guerrillas who were involved in the infamous Black Hawk Down incident. After leaving Afghanistan, for a time bin Laden was heavily active in the country of Sudan. And to this very day, in northern Africa, Islamic extremist movements and terrorist groups are proliferating. But again, as I've been saying all along, much of this conflict stems from the very structure imposed by the ideal of nationalism and its vehicle, the UN. The process of decolonialization did not address the underlying issue of protecting minority rights. setting the stage for many civil wars and conflicts. In 1947, the NAACP's appeal to the UN's Commission on Human Rights to denounce racism in America was ignored. Inconvenient minority groups all over the world, when they lacked a home nation to return to, had no rights or representation that the international community